They told him his war would be fought with binoculars and a telephone. Flight Sergeant Thomas Ridley wasn't supposed to fire a single shot. His orders were explicit: observe, report, and let the proper warriors handle the killing. But between September 1940 and March 1941, this 32-year-old former railway clerk would orchestrate the destruction of 31 Luftwaffe bombers, not through courage or marksmanship, but through something the German High Command never anticipated: mathematical precision married to working-class stubbornness. The Luftwaffe had radar. They had numerical superiority. What they didn't have was Thomas Ridley. 11:47 p.m., 7th September 1940, RAF Kenley, Surrey. The stench of burning oil hung thick over the operations room as Thomas Ridley pressed the bakelite telephone receiver against his ear, listening to the crackle of static mixed with the distant thunder of German engines. The walls still bore scorch marks from the raid 3 days earlier. Kenley had been bombed twice in 72 hours, and the patched concrete floor testified to how close they'd come to losing the sector station entirely. Outside, searchlights carved desperate white columns through the darkness, while somewhere overhead, Heinkels droned towards London with their bellies full of incendiaries. Hostile formation, bearing 270, altitude 12,000, count 20 plus, Ridley said into the mouthpiece, his Lancashire accent flattening the words into clipped efficiency. Estimated speed 185 knots, course holding steady for London. The voice that answered belonged to squadron leader Marcus Pemberton, currently circling above Kent with 11 hurricanes and fuel for perhaps 40 minutes more. Understood, Kenley. We're positioning for intercept. Ridley replaced the receiver and returned to the plotting table, where WAF plotters moved counters across the map with quiet precision. The operations room smelled of sweat, cigarette smoke, and the peculiar electrical tang of overworked radio equipment. 23 women and 14 men worked under flickering electric lights, coordinating the defense of southeastern England, whilst German bombs fell with mechanical regularity every single night since the 7th of September, a date Londoners were already calling Black Saturday. The statistics were brutal, and everyone in the operations room knew them. Since July, Fighter Command had lost 1,023 aircraft. The Luftwaffe had lost more, nearly 1,900, but Germany had more to lose. Britain was hemorrhaging pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Every Hurricane cost $5,000. Every Spitfire cost $9,500. Every trained fighter pilot represented 18 months of instruction. And the Luftwaffe kept coming night after night, wave after wave, grinding down British defences through simple mathematical attrition. Thomas Ridley understood these mathematics intimately. Before the war, he'd worked for the London and North Eastern Railway, calculating freight schedules and optimizing locomotive turnaround times. The skills that once ensured coal trains ran on time now served a grimmer purpose, predicting where German bombers would appear over English skies. The problem was straightforward, but seemingly insoluble. British radar could detect incoming raids, but radar provided only approximate positions and couldn't distinguish individual aircraft within formations. Once bombers crossed the coast, they vanished into darkness where searchlights rarely found them, and night fighters struggled hopelessly. British anti-aircraft guns fired blind, expending thousands of shells for each aircraft damaged. The Observer Corps, volunteer civilians scattered across the countryside, could hear engines but rarely see targets. Meanwhile, London burned. Fighter Command's doctrine presumed daylight operations. Night fighting meant pilots chasing engine sounds through absolute blackness, finding targets through luck rather than skill, firing at shapes half glimpsed in searchlight beams. The mathematics were appalling. On average, British night fighters required 47 interception attempts to achieve one confirmed kill. 47 attempts, one kill. At that rate, Britain would lose the war through simple exhaustion. Ridley had been a radar operator since June, one of hundreds trained hastily as the Battle of Britain intensified. His job description was unambiguous: receive radar plots from chain home stations, correlate them with Observer Corps reports, vector fighters towards contacts, and report results to group headquarters. He was, explicitly and repeatedly, told not to improvise. The system worked through rigid adherence to established procedures. Individual initiative was discouraged because it introduced chaos into carefully orchestrated operations. But the system was failing. Every morning brought fresh casualty reports, not just from Fighter Command, but from London itself, where civilians died in hundreds, then thousands. By mid-September, over 7,000 Londoners were dead. Another 9,000 were seriously injured. The Luftwaffe was burning Britain's capital at minimal cost, and the system designed to stop them couldn't intercept effectively in darkness. Ridley noticed patterns others missed. German bombers followed predictable routes, up the Thames estuary, along railway lines, towards major landmarks visible even at night. They flew consistent altitudes, between 10 and 14,000 feet, because flying lower meant more accurate anti-aircraft fire, whilst flying higher reduced bombing accuracy. Their formations were rigid, maintaining tight spacing, because German doctrine emphasized mutual defensive fire. The telephone rang again, another raid inbound. 23 aircraft, bearing from France, altitude 12,000 feet. Ridley logged the contact, calculated intercept vectors, and dispatched the information. Squadron leader Pemberton would find empty sky, again, because by the time Hurricanes reached the interception point, German bombers would be 5 miles away, safely invisible in darkness. "Sector Controller says we're to stop improvising," said WAF Corporal Jennifer Hastings, delivering the message with careful neutrality. "Group HQ has lodged complaints about inconsistent reporting procedures." Ridley lit a cigarette, watching smoke curl towards the ceiling. Outside, London was burning. Inside, Group Headquarters was concerned about paperwork. "Tell the Sector Controller I'll comply with standing orders," Ridley said. Then quietly, "But I'll be taking additional notes for personal reference." Hastings met his eyes for 3 seconds, understanding perfectly what personal reference meant, then returned to her plotting table without another word. That night, whilst German bombers turned London's East End into an inferno visible from 60 miles away, Thomas Ridley began constructing what would become known, decades later, when files were finally declassified, as the Ridley Intercept Tables. He was a flight sergeant. He had no authority to redesign Fighter Command's operational doctrine. He was supposed to observe, report, and obey. He decided to win the war instead. The decision wasn't dramatic. No stirring speeches, no grand declarations, just a railway clerk turned radar operator sitting in a bomb-damaged operations room beneath Surrey, filling a notebook with calculations whilst overhead, London burned and the Luftwaffe flew unmolested through British skies. The mathematics said Britain would lose. Thomas Ridley, who understood mathematics better than most, decided the mathematics were wrong. 2:15 a.m., 11 September 1940. RAF Kenley Operations Room. The numbers defied belief at first glance. Ridley had covered 16 pages of a requisitioned logbook with calculations derived from 3 nights of continuous observation. Bomber speeds correlated against wind direction, altitude variations measured against cloud cover, intercept angles plotted against fighter patrol patterns. The data revealed what Fighter Command's doctrine couldn't accommodate. German bomber formations weren't random. They were predictable with mathematical precision. "You're plotting their navigation," said Flight Lieutenant David Ashworth, peering over Ridley's shoulder at 3 a.m., whilst somewhere overhead another raid droned towards London. Ashworth was a former mathematics lecturer from Cambridge who'd been transferred to Kenley after sustaining facial burns that ended his flying career. "You're calculating where they'll be, not where they are." "Where they are doesn't matter," Ridley replied, not looking up from his tables. "By the time we vector fighters, where they are is 5 minutes obsolete. We need where they will be in 8 minutes, accounting for wind drift and assuming they maintain course towards primary targets." The concept was elegant. German bombers followed railroad lines and rivers because these provided navigation references visible even at night. They maintained consistent speeds because deviating meant breaking formation. They flew towards specific targets, docks, factories, rail yards, following predictable approach vectors. Therefore, if you knew where a bomber was at point A and understood which target they were likely approaching, you could calculate where they'd be at point B with reasonable accuracy. The problem was implementing this insight whilst working 18-hour shifts in a concrete room that shook when anti-aircraft guns fired, with equipment prone to failure, under constant threat of bombing, and without official sanction to deviate from established procedures. The physical conditions were relentlessly hostile. Kenley's operations room was underground but not bomb-proof. The ventilation system barely functioned, leaving the air thick with cigarette smoke and body odor from too many people working too many hours in too small a space. The plotting table's electric lights flickered during heavy gunfire. The telephone lines crackled with interference. Radar plots arrived by landline from chain home stations miles away, introducing delays that made time-critical calculations even more difficult. The equipment was barely adequate. The plotting table used counters pushed by wooden sticks, technology essentially unchanged since 1918. Radar provided only approximate positions, often with errors of several miles. The Observer Corps reported by telephone, describing what they heard rather than what they saw. Fighter pilots navigated by compass and dead reckoning, without instrument landing systems or reliable radio navigation. The entire defensive system depended on human operators correlating imprecise information under extreme pressure, whilst sleep-deprived and working conditions that would violate peacetime labor regulations. Ridley was operating on 4 hours of sleep per night, subsisting on naffy tea, cigarettes, and whatever meals could be grabbed between raids. His uniform smelled of stale sweat. His eyes burned from studying maps under inadequate lighting. His hands shook slightly from exhaustion and too much caffeine. Everyone in the operations room existed in similar condition, functional but not healthy, pushed past normal human limits by simple, desperate necessity. The bureaucratic resistance was immediate and predictable. Group headquarters wanted consistency, not innovation. Sector controllers worried about Ridley exceeding his authority. Senior officers, exhausted themselves, lacked energy to evaluate unorthodox suggestions from flight sergeants. The system ran on rigid procedures because rigid procedures prevented chaos, and introducing experimental techniques during active combat operations struck many as recklessly dangerous. "You're proposing we vector fighters to empty sky based on calculations in a notebook," said Squadron Leader Pemberton when Ridley finally explained his approach. "If you're wrong, we waste fuel and pilots accomplish nothing. If you're right but your timing is off by 2 minutes, we still accomplish nothing. And if you're right but German bombers deviate from your predicted course, we look like incompetent fools. If we do nothing differently, we'll continue achieving current results," Ridley replied, with the flat pragmatism characteristic of northern working-class culture. "Current results being London burning every night, whilst we chase empty sky." Pemberton was silent for 15 seconds, listening to the distant crump of bombs falling somewhere over Surrey. Finally, "One attempt. If your vectors prove accurate, we'll try again. If not, back to standard procedures." 17 September 1940. 11:23 p.m. The test came on a clear night with quarter moon, ideal conditions for what Ridley was attempting. Chain-home radar detected a formation crossing the coast near Dover. 18 aircraft, altitude 12,000 feet, course northwest towards London. Standard procedure would vector fighters to intercept based on current position. Ridley's tables predicted the formation would follow the Thames, maintaining course for London's docks, which meant they'd cross a specific point over Kent in exactly 9 minutes. Vector Squadron Leader Pemberton to grid reference TQ4267, Ridley said into the telephone, his voice steady despite the stakes. Altitude 12,000 feet, patrol holding pattern, contact expected in 9 minutes. That's 12 miles ahead of the current plot, said the sector controller. You're vectoring to empty sky. I'm vectoring to where they will be, sir, not where they are. 9 minutes felt interminable. Ridley chain-smoked 3 cigarettes, eyes fixed on the plotting table where WAF plotters moved counters representing both German bombers and British fighters. If his calculations were wrong, Pemberton would find nothing. If the Germans deviated, Pemberton would find nothing. If winds aloft differed from ground observations, Pemberton would find nothing. At 11:32 p.m., Pemberton's voice crackled through the radio. "Kenley, this is Red Leader. I have visual contact. Multiple targets, exactly where you said they'd be. Engaging now." The operations room erupted in restrained celebration. Nothing dramatic, just quiet satisfaction. 3 Heinkels went down that night, confirmed by Observer Corps reports and crash site investigations. Pemberton burned through ammunition and fuel, but for the first time in weeks, British fighters had found German bombers in darkness without relying on luck. "Do it again," Pemberton said simply when he landed at 12:40 a.m., face blackened with smoke, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. "Tomorrow night, we'll try it again." And they did. Night after night, whilst London continued burning, whilst casualties mounted, whilst exhaustion ground everyone down, Ridley refined his intercept tables. Not every attempt succeeded. Winds shifted, bombers deviated, equipment failed, human error introduced mistakes. But the success rate climbed from 2% to 8%, then to 15%. German bombers still reached London, but they paid higher costs. Luftwaffe crews began reporting increased fighter activity. German intelligence officers noted rising losses and couldn't identify why British night defences had suddenly improved. The human cost was mounting. Ridley developed persistent migraines from eye strain. His hands shook constantly from exhaustion. He began experiencing auditory hallucinations during particularly long shifts, phantom telephone rings, imaginary aircraft engines. YAF Corporal Hastings fainted twice from exhaustion before finally accepting medical leave. Pemberton, flying multiple sorties per night, aged visibly, developing facial tics and 1,000-yard stare characteristic of acute combat stress. But the mathematics were changing. For the first time since the Blitz began, German bomber formations were encountering organized resistance in darkness. The Luftwaffe's assumption, that night provided safety, was being systematically disproven by a railway clerk with a notebook, operating from a concrete room beneath Surrey, subsisting on tea and cigarettes whilst London burned overhead. The operation was working, barely, held together by human determination and willingness to continue functioning past any reasonable limit. The cost was brutal, but the alternative was watching London die without fighting back. And Thomas Ridley, exhausted railway clerk turned improbable tactician, had decided that mathematics could be beaten by better mathematics. If you were willing to work 18 hours daily whilst bombs fell and official doctrine said what you were attempting was impossible, he was willing, so were the others. So they continued. Luftwaffe headquarters, occupied France. 29 September 1940. Oberst Heinrich Vogel studied the loss reports with growing unease, the statistical patterns suggesting something fundamentally wrong with German assumptions about British defensive capabilities. 23 bombers lost in the past 12 days, not to anti-aircraft fire or random fighter patrols, but to precisely coordinated night interceptions that shouldn't be possible given British technological limitations. "They're anticipating our approach vectors," Vogel said to his intelligence staff, tapping the map spread across the briefing table. "Look at the pattern. These aren't random encounters. British fighters are positioned ahead of our formations, waiting at intercept points. That requires either precognition or intelligence sources we haven't identified." The Luftwaffe had entered the night bombing campaign with well-founded confidence. German crews possessed superior training in instrument flying. German bombers carried better navigation equipment. German doctrine emphasized tight formations, providing mutual defensive fire. Most critically, German intelligence assessed that British night fighter capabilities were essentially non-existent. British pilots lacked proper instruments. British radar couldn't track aircraft with sufficient precision for night interceptions, and British controllers couldn't coordinate complex operations in darkness. Those assessments were now manifestly incorrect. The losses weren't catastrophic yet. 23 aircraft from hundreds of sorties represented acceptable attrition. But the trend was concerning. In the campaign's first week, Luftwaffe bombers operated over Britain with near impunity, encountering fighters only through random chance. By the third week, interception rates had tripled. British fighters were appearing at specific locations, at precise altitudes, as if controllers somewhere possessed perfect intelligence about German flight plans. Could they have broken our navigation codes, suggested Hauptmann Otto Steiner, Vogel's senior intelligence analyst. Navigation orders are transmitted by landline, not radio, Vogel replied. They'd need agents inside our briefing rooms, which is implausible. Something else is operating. The explanation eluded them because it contradicted German doctrinal assumptions. Luftwaffe intelligence knew British radar existed. German aircraft had photographed chain home towers repeatedly. But German experts assessed that radar provided only approximate positions, insufficient for guiding fighters to night interceptions. The idea that British controllers might be calculating future bomber positions through mathematical prediction didn't occur to German analysts because such techniques weren't part of German doctrine. German operations relied on superior equipment and training, not improvisation. British fighter pilots were reporting the intercepts with visible confusion themselves. Squadron leader Pemberton logged, vectored to grid reference, arrived to find targets exactly where control predicted. Engaged 2 Heinkels, both damaged, 1 probable kill. Control's navigation accuracy borders on supernatural. Other pilots used similar language. Impossible precision, uncanny accuracy, as if control could see through darkness. The reality was simpler and more mundane. Thomas Ridley, working 18-hour shifts in a concrete room, had developed intercept tables, allowing prediction of bomber positions within acceptable margins. No sophisticated equipment, no broken codes, no intelligence network, just mathematics applied by an exhausted railway clerk who understood that predictable systems could be predicted. German commanders, accustomed to expecting British incompetence, struggled to accept that Britain might be innovating. Luftwaffe doctrine presumed German technological and tactical superiority. When British defences improved, German analysis searched for explanations consistent with that presumption. Perhaps British radar was better than assessed. Perhaps Americans had supplied new equipment. Perhaps British intelligence had penetrated German security. The actual explanation, that British controllers were simply calculating better, was too simple to be considered. The first direct engagement, where Ridley's methods proved decisively superior, occurred on 5 October. A large German formation, 37 bombers, approached London following a route Ridley had seen them use repeatedly. His tables predicted they'd reach a specific intercept point at 11:47 p.m. Pemberton, flying with 19 Hurricanes, arrived at 11:45 p.m. and established patrol pattern. "Tally-ho!" Pemberton transmitted at 11:46 p.m. "Multiple contacts. Altitude 12,000, exactly as briefed. Engaging." The battle lasted 11 minutes. British fighters tore through the German formation with devastating effectiveness because Germans weren't expecting resistance at that location. Pemberton's squadron claimed 8 confirmed kills, 4 probables, and 6 damaged. Extraordinary results for night combat. German crews, expecting clear run to London, instead found British fighters already positioned, already attacking, already disrupting formations before bombs could be released. Luftwaffe intelligence intercepted British radio transmissions from that engagement. The transcripts were analysed by German signals experts seeking insights into British tactics. One fragment proved particularly perplexing. A British pilot radioed, "Control, how the devil did you know they'd be here?" The response from ground control, Ridley's voice, though Germans didn't know his identity, was brief. "Mathematics, old boy. Just mathematics." German analysts dismissed this as British humour or deliberate deception. Mathematics couldn't predict aircraft movements with precision sufficient for night interceptions. The suggestion was absurd. There must be some hidden technological advantage. New radar, American equipment, perhaps early warning from covert agents in France. German commanders ordered increased security around airfields, changed approach routes randomly, varied altitudes and speeds. The adaptations helped slightly, but didn't solve the fundamental problem. Thomas Ridley's tables adapted faster. By mid-October, Luftwaffe bomber crews were experiencing something unprecedented: fear of British night defences. Crews who'd flown confidently through August and September now approached English coast with palpable nervousness. Psychological stress mounted. Morale reports noted increasing reluctance, rising sick call rates, growing requests for transfers to other theatres. The invincible Luftwaffe was learning what the Royal Air Force had endured during daylight battles, that operating over hostile territory against competent defenders exacted crushing psychological costs. The Luftwaffe's response was predictable and doctrinally constrained. German commanders increased formation sizes, providing more defensive firepower. They introduced variability into approach routes, hoping to confuse British controllers. They experimented with different altitudes and speeds. These adaptations demonstrated professional competence but addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem remained. British controllers were predicting bomber locations accurately enough to position fighters effectively. German intelligence never solved the puzzle during the war itself. Post-war analysis, conducted after captured British documents became available, revealed the truth. An exhausted railway clerk, working from a concrete room with inadequate equipment, had defeated Luftwaffe bomber streams through sheer mathematical analysis. No sophisticated technology, no intelligence coup, no dramatic tactical innovation, just careful observation, statistical analysis, and willingness to trust calculations over doctrine. The Luftwaffe had experience, they had equipment, they had numbers. What they lacked was Thomas Ridley. And by the time German commanders understood this, 31 of their bombers had fallen from English skies, guided to destruction by vectors calculated in a notebook by a man who wasn't supposed to fight at all. RAF Kenley, 15th of March, 1941. The operations room was quieter now than during those desperate autumn nights when London burned and every raid felt like potential defeat. Thomas Ridley, promoted to warrant officer in February, stood before the plotting table reviewing intercept statistics with satisfaction tempered by exhaustion. Since September, fighters guided by his vector calculations had destroyed 31 confirmed German bombers, damaged 73 others, and disrupted countless raids through forced evasive maneuvers. The Blitz continued, would continue until May, but the Luftwaffe was paying costs unsustainable for any air force. The numbers told the story. In September 1940, British night fighters achieved successful interceptions in 2% of attempts. By March 1941, using Ridley's methods, that figure had climbed to 28%, still frustrating but representing mathematical transformation of defensive effectiveness. The Luftwaffe had lost 421 aircraft over Britain during the night Blitz period. Ridley's direct contributions represented 7% of those losses, but the psychological impact was disproportionate. German crews knew British defences were improving, but couldn't identify why, creating uncertainty that degraded operational effectiveness far beyond simple loss statistics. The human cost had been extraordinary. Ridley himself was gaunt, having lost 23 pounds since September. His hands trembled continuously from exhaustion. He'd developed chronic insomnia. When finally given leave to rest, he couldn't sleep, awakened repeatedly by phantom telephone sounds and imaginary aircraft engines. WAF Corporal Hastings had been medically discharged in January, suffering nervous breakdown. Squadron Leader Pemberton was grounded in February after nearly crashing during landing due to exhaustion-induced disorientation. Of the 14 personnel who'd worked in Kenley's operations room that first desperate night in September, only 6 remained by March. The others had been rotated out, medically discharged, or, in 2 cases, killed when a German bomber struck Kenley's officers' quarters in October, but they'd succeeded. Fighter Command's official doctrine now incorporated predictive vector techniques as standard procedure. Training schools taught controllers to calculate intercept positions using methods derived directly from Ridley's notebooks. The improvised system had become official policy, validated through 6 months of brutal operational testing. Britain hadn't defeated the Luftwaffe. That would require years more fighting, but Britain had proven that German bombers couldn't operate over England without paying costs that degraded German strategic capability. The transformation reached beyond immediate tactical applications. Ridley's approach demonstrated that warfare could be revolutionized through mathematical analysis applied by personnel traditionally considered non-combat support. After the war, this insight would inform operational research, the systematic application of analytical methods to military problems. The field would grow from wartime improvisation into respected discipline, reshaping how modern militaries approach complex operations. Thomas Ridley, exhausted railway clerk, had pioneered techniques that would eventually become standard across NATO forces. The recognition came slowly, filtered through institutional conservatism. Ridley was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal in April 1941, unusual because DFMs were typically reserved for aircrew. The citation was carefully worded, describing exceptional skill in fighter direction, without specifying details that remained classified. Squadron Leader Pemberton, recovered from exhaustion, nominated Ridley for the George Medal. That recommendation was denied. Administrative staff argued that Ridley's contributions, though valuable, didn't constitute the level of personal risk the George Medal required. Ridley never knew about the nomination, which remained buried in files until declassified decades later. He continued working through 1941, training new controllers, refining intercept tables, adapting methods as Luftwaffe tactics evolved. By autumn, large-scale German bombing raids had essentially ceased. The Luftwaffe was redeploying eastward for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Soviet Union. Britain had survived. London had endured 57 consecutive nights of bombing, had buried thousands of dead, had emerged traumatized but functional. German ambitions to force British surrender through air power alone had failed, partially because Thomas Ridley had made German bombers pay costs their commanders couldn't sustain. In 1943, Ridley was transferred to Fighter Command Headquarters, tasked with establishing formal training programs for controller personnel. He worked there until war's end, systematizing the improvisations that had been born during desperate September nights. His students would apply these methods throughout the war, directing fighters over Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. The techniques Ridley pioneered, predictive vectoring, mathematical intercept calculation, systematic analysis of enemy operational patterns, became fundamental to modern air defense doctrine. After the war, Thomas Ridley returned to civilian life with characteristic modesty. He resumed working for British Railways, eventually retiring in 1963 as district traffic manager for East Anglia region. He married in 1947, had 3 children, lived unremarkably in suburban Norwich. He rarely discussed his wartime service, even with family. His wife knew he'd worked in fighter command operations. She didn't know about the 31 bombers until historians located him in 1978. When finally interviewed for the Imperial War Museum's Oral History Project, Ridley was 70 years old, retired, living in modest terrace house overlooking Norwich Cathedral. The interviewer asked how he felt about his wartime contributions. Ridley paused for nearly 10 seconds before answering with characteristic understatement. "I did what needed doing. We all did. People were dying and the system wasn't working properly, so we fixed the system. That's all. Nothing heroic about mathematics. But there was heroism in the mathematics, not the dramatic heroism of fighter pilots or commandos, but the quiet heroism of exhausted professionals who refused to accept defeat as inevitable, who trusted calculations over doctrine, who worked 18-hour days whilst bombs fell, because refusing to work meant watching people die unnecessarily. That peculiarly British combination of pragmatism, stubbornness, and understated determination that sustained the nation through its darkest period. The historical recognition came gradually. Academic researchers examining declassified RAF files identified Ridley's role in the mid-1970s. Published studies appeared in the 1980s, documenting how predictive vectoring had transformed night fighter effectiveness during the Blitz. By the time Ridley died in 1986, aged 78, historians understood his contribution. The obituary in the Times described him accurately. The man who taught mathematics to defeat the Luftwaffe. His legacy endures in every modern air defense system, every control room where analysts calculate intercept vectors, every tactical operations center where mathematical prediction guides military operations. The technology is sophisticated now. Computers process data in microseconds. Radar provides precision unimaginable in 1940. Satellite systems track aircraft globally. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged, that predictable systems can be predicted, that careful analysis overcomes apparent impossibility, that determination and mathematics can defeat seemingly superior force. Thomas Ridley was ordered to observe targets. Instead, he calculated their destruction. 31 German bombers fell because a railway clerk refused to accept that established doctrine represented the only possible approach. In doing so, he demonstrated something fundamental about British character during the war, that when faced with impossible situations, ordinary people simply got on with making the impossible work, applying whatever skills they possessed, improvising solutions when official systems failed, and then returning to ordinary lives without expecting recognition. They told him just to spot targets. He proved that spotting, done properly, was itself a weapon, and in the process, he helped save a nation. If this story of quiet heroism resonates with you, if you believe the unsung contributors deserve recognition alongside famous names, please subscribe to this channel. We're committed to uncovering these forgotten narratives, sharing Britain's hidden history, and ensuring that people like Thomas Ridley aren't lost to time. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, or tell us about unsung heroes from your own family's wartime experience. History belongs to all of us. Let's preserve it together.